Sometimes writers really bust their humps to come up with some cool bad guys for the heroes to fight, only to soon realize that they may fit much better fighting someone else. There are a lot of things to think about when you cook up villains for a superhero to fight. Things like backstory, personal relations, personality, power sets, or even just surface theming can really make or break a villain. But sometimes the pieces just don't quite come together. But in this environmentally considerate day and age, you'll be happy to know that comic books have always been good at recycling, and that many bad guys found their ways to other titles, sometimes even becoming primary enemies of a wholly different hero than the one they were first created to oppose. Come on everybody, all together now. Who is Daredevil's archenemy? That's right, Kingpin! But everyone who shouted bullseye still gets a participation trophy. After being featured in both the 2003 movie and the Netflix adaptation, there is no doubt that even those who don't normally read comic books know by now that Daredevil and Kingpin are each other's deadliest foes. But back when the blind superhero was first introduced, his intended archenemy was the flying crime boss known as the Owl, all while Kingpin made his debut in Spider-Man's book. His appearances were somewhat rare, however, and it wasn't until Frank Miller's iconic Daredevil run in the 1980s that he really made his mark as a major baddie in Marvel Comics. With Spider-Man handling the more colorful criminals that populate New York and Daredevil having been retooled to focus on the city's more grimy underbelly, it just made perfect sense for him to fight a more traditional crime boss. Granted, Kingpin is still very much a part of Spidey's rogues gallery to this day, but nobody can deny that with Daredevil, things get much more nasty and personal much faster. If you hadn't heard of King Shark before, you almost certainly have by now. With major appearances in the Harley Quinn animated series and James Gunn's Suicide Squad movie among others, Big Chompy over here has stolen the hearts of audiences everywhere. With a combination of an intimidating design and a goofy personality, it's just really hard to not be entertained by this fishy fella. Even if he is in the habit of, biting people's heads off and stuff. King Shark has bounced around in the comics a bit, fighting heroes like Batman and the Flash, and has had a fair few encounters with Aquaman. Because, well, duh, right? But it may surprise you that, of all heroes, King Shark was introduced as an adversary of Superboy! This was back in his oh god help us, this is what superheroes looked like in the 90s days, when King Shark was snacking on locals and tourists alike on the beaches of Hawaii. That is until Connell took him down with some well-placed heat vision. Solomon Grundy has been a mainstay of the DC universe for quite a while by now. For those that may not know, Grundy's whole deal is that after being murdered and thrown into Slaughter Swamp, he now rises back out of that same swamp every time he's put down, with slight variations to his personality and his power level. This makes him a very versatile villain, and he's often depicted as part of major supervillain teams or used against novice and unpowered heroes for them to prove their skills against. He can go toe-to-toe with Superman on a good day though, so he's definitely no slouch. But perhaps surprisingly, the nursery rhyme-based ghoul was actually first created to fight Green Lantern! Wait, no, not that one. Or 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 that one. Bingo! This guy, Alan Scott, the original Green Lantern. See, when Alan was introduced in the 1940s, the Lantern was magical, not alien, and one of its weaknesses was that it couldn't directly affect wood. And since Grundy's body largely consists of materials from the swamp, the old great giant was naturally resistant to it. Which meant that our hero had to trick Grundy into jumping in front of a moving train in order to take him down. By now, the X-Men as a whole have a massive collection of villains. But over the years, one of the most popular X-Men, Wolverine, has collected a few baddies that are all his own. And the most famous one of these is no doubt Victor Creed, Sabretooth. He was created only 3 years later, he has almost identical powers, he's much more willing to embrace his feral characteristics than Logan is, and he's just an utterly vicious bastard all around. But, I hear you cry, if he is such a perfect fit for Logan, then he couldn't possibly have been created for anyone else, right? Wrong. As it turns out, Sabretooth was introduced in 1977 fighting Iron Fist of all people. He was first introduced as a non-powered serial killer and then became a recurring antagonist of both Danny Rand and his buddy Luke Cage, known back then as Power Man. It actually took a whole 9 years before Chris Claremont brought him over to the X-Men and retooled him as a mutant. But ever since then, he's been the badass Wolverine villain that we know and love today. Sticking with the X-Men for a bit, there is one villain who also started somewhere completely different. That would be the shape-shifting Raven Darkholme, known better as Mystique. With a boatload of powers, the most iconic being her ability to morph into almost anyone, Mystique has been a pain in the X-Men's rear end for decades, and is even related to a few of them. Specifically, she's the biological mother of Nightcrawler and the adoptive mother of Rogue. She couldn't be more tightly connected to the X-Men if she went and stapled herself to one of them, but once again, she was created for someone completely different. She was actually first introduced as an enemy of Carol Danvers back when she was known as Miss Marvel. She had a pretty good claim to the title of archenemy as well, what with killing Carol's boyfriend and everything. It's quite rare for her to give Carol much of a thought nowadays though. But I mean, hey, if you were constantly screwing with the X-Men and establishing new Brotherhood of Evil Mutant teams every other Saturday, you'd probably forget your old playmates too. Funnily enough, her and Sabretooth also have a son, the completely human Graydon Creed. Well, birds of a feather, I suppose. It probably comes as no surprise that Spider-Man has appropriated quite a few villains from other heroes over the years. Whenever a villain can't quite hack it in their original title, they tend to become semi-regular punching bags for old webhead to deal with. This is true even for long runners like the smarmy, backstabbing thief Fred Myers, who you know better as Boomerang. And before you ask, yes, he is Australian. Comic books are just subtle like that. Armed with deadly trick boomerangs, Fred usually doesn't bother with any plans much loftier than finding the next big score and getting himself some quick cash, only to then get knocked out by Spider-Man time and time again. And you know what? Good for him, because if he'd kept fighting his original foe, he'd most likely have ended up splattered all over the sidewalk. After all, the first superhero Boomerang went up against was the frickin' Hulk! Lord only knows what Stan Lee was on when he came up with pitting a guy who throws boomerangs against a towering mass of muscle that's so strong he can literally create shockwaves just by clapping his hands, but whatever it was, man, I want some, that stuff sounds good. The plant-based supervillain Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, is probably best known for his appearance in Alan Moore's run on Swamp Thing back in the 80s. In this series, his botanical knowledge got him hired to figure out how the Swamp Thing even came to be in the first place. And since then, he has been so closely associated with this character that he was presented as a major antagonist in the recent short-lived Swamp Thing live-action series. Neil Gaiman also later gave him a big part in the backstory of the more popular Batman villain Poison Ivy. So if his name sounds familiar, you might remember him from Batman and Robin or the animated film Batman and Harley Quinn. But he was actually introduced as the first villain Ray Palmer, the Atom, fought in his own self-titled comic. In this first appearance, Woodrue was presented as an exile from a world inhabited by plant spirits. He then kidnapped their queen and forced her to help him commit crimes alongside his own genetically enhanced plants. It was only later that he used an experimental formula to become an actual plant person. Sometimes, a character does something so insane that their act becomes more famous than the character themselves. And that is definitely the case with Major Force. Created as an evil counterpart to the nuclear-powered Captain Atom, Major Force was a vile bastard headed for a life sentence for the many atrocious acts he'd committed. But in typical shady deep state military fashion, he was offered a pardon in exchange for undergoing experiments similar to what gave Captain Atom his powers. And let's just say that it worked a little bit too well. But while he is considered Captain Atom's archenemy, you probably know him much better for what he did to Kyle Rayner's girlfriend Alexandra DeWitt back when he was the Green Lantern. Having been hired to steal Kyle's ring, Major Force decided to send the guy a message by murdering Alexandra and stuffing her corpse in the fridge for him to find. Needless to say, he became that arc's final villain as a result of this. This act is so infamous that it coined the term fridging, which refers to the unfortunately very common trope of horribly brutalizing a hero's female love interest for little good narrative reason other than to motivate the male hero. That is a hell of a claim to fame right there. Say, remember the Ghost Rider movies? Yeah, those certainly exist. Okay, in this MCU day and age, these movies might not be quite that fondly remembered. But seeing Nicolas Cage play something as bombastic as a flame-headed biker skeleton packed with the powers of hell is nonetheless incredibly entertaining. And fans were definitely excited to see him. Being one of the most famous characters to come out of the Marvel Universe's horror-based line of comics in the 70s will do that for ya. So obviously, the film's antagonist, the demon Blackheart, son of frickin' Mephisto, has to be a major baddie from the comics, right? Well, not quite. Sure, he's faced Ghost Rider a few times, more than many of the other heroes he's fought, but Blackheart kinda just shows up wherever he feels like and fights whoever happens to stop by. His very first appearance, however, was in Daredevil, where he and Spider-Man battled him at an old amusement park shortly after Mephisto created him. Vermin, a super strong cannibalistic creature with the ability to communicate with rats, is a neat fit for a New York superhero like Spider-Man, who already has plenty of animal-themed villains to his name. And he is definitely most well known to comic book readers for his role as a supporting antagonist in the critically acclaimed story Kraven's Last Hunt, written by J.M. DeMatteis in 1987. In this story, Kraven beat the snot out of Vermin after seemingly killing Spider-Man and donning his costume, wishing to prove himself Peter's superior. After Peter's return, Kraven then released Vermin, who naturally attacked Peter in retaliation, and he was only narrowly defeated and captured. And ever since then, he's shown up to menace Spidey on a few occasions. However, Vermin's origins lie with none other than Captain America. He was originally an abused youth living on the street before he was kidnapped and turned into a rat man by Baron Zemo and Arnim Zola, who then sicked him on the good captain like some kind of attack dog. After a few appearances, he then made his way to New York, where Cap took him down alongside, who else? Spider-Man, which made the transition to his ever-expanding rogues gallery just a little bit smoother. It can actually be a really fun game to play. Take one of the many villains out there and try to find a better fit for them to fight against in the future. Go ahead, kids, try it at home. I'm sure there's plenty of you out there who can come up with some truly crazy combinations.